Welcome everybody to the Junior Parent Coffee and Conversation for the 2021 school year for the junior class. So this is an exciting time, a little bit different doing it virtually this year via Zoom, like anything else. So I know it's been a stressful year, a different year for a lot of you, especially as we approach the college application and search season. But hopefully this helps answer some questions, put some of you guys at ease, and starts a dialogue or encourages more dialogue and conversation between us and your families and students as they start really getting down to the wire for their college search and application process. So the great thing is too, before we get into this, although it's been obviously the craziest time, hopefully most of us will experience in our lifetime, the college process has stayed, the same with some things that are going to change eventually. So either way, as I was saying, so it's totally stressful in a lot of ways, but the great news is the college process and search process hasn't changed dramatically. There's some key things that we'll talk about that will be a little bit different, and that might be different past this year too. But overall, the nuts and bolts of the process is the same, and we can help as we start going through this process. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. So the topics for today. So advice for junior year success, post-high school planning events we have coming up. PSAT and standardized testing, and that is one area that has had some significant changes this year, so we'll get into those. The college search process, the applications, the application process, Naviance and other resources, and we'll touch on financial aid as well. So advice for students. So students this is a little bit of, they're already in the midst of this, but the students should continue to take challenging courses junior and senior year. So as we approach the schedule workshops coming up in March, students will want to think really thoughtfully about their senior year classes as well. So they'll want to continue working as hard as they can, taking rigorous courses where they can, and putting their best foot forward academically. They'll want to stay involved in extracurricular and community service activities when possible. I know that landscape has changed a little bit, but they want to still try to remain active in this environment. Form positive relationships with their teachers. And they want to begin researching and planning for life, obviously, after Cohasset High School, which is part of this. So some Cohasset events for postgraduate planning coming up. So we have we had some junior workshops last week, actually. So some of you may have heard about those. So in those workshops, we went over some of the things we're going over today, and we reintroduced students into Naviance. We went over standardized testing and what they should be thinking about. We used some of the resources in Naviance to help them with a college search. And then we also showed them some of the things that they're responsible for in working in Naviance to make sure that the application process goes smoothly. They are expected to meet with us individually. We tend to roll those meetings into scheduling meetings as well, but we are available to meet before then if they want to. And we really help brainstorm their course studies for next year. We talk about where they are in their search process, some things that they proactively can do to help start putting their best foot forward as they prepare to apply to some of those schools that they're researching. And we'll talk to them about a testing plan for their SAT or their ACT. So the PSAT. So most of you, or all of you really at this point, should have received your results, and you would receive those through the college board, the student's college board account. So they are sent here, and we have them available for anyone who hasn't received them. But to get all the benefits of having the PSAT scores, the students want to go into their college board account, and they can see a comprehensive breakdown of how they performed on the PSAT. In the PSAT or in College Board, in their College Board account, they'll have a report that goes over their strengths and weaknesses, And they're also able to enroll in Khan Academy, which provides more support and resources to help prepare them to take the SAT. So there's a lot of different tools that they can use from the, from College Board, and they should take the time to go through their PSAT results in the College Board, in their College Board accounts. So standardized testing. So before I get into standardized testing, I think it's important to really emphasize or note most schools for this year are still test optional. So that includes state schools like UMass Amherst. That's really everyone. There's very few schools. There's no schools right now that I can even think of that are requiring standardized testing for next year's students. So they're test optional. So that is a huge change for a lot of these schools, and it's just part of the college application environment right now. Having said that, this year, as opposed to last year's class, it seems are they going to be able to take standardized testing? So the SAT and the ACT, they're both accepted across all schools. So if the school requires standardized testing, they'll accept either the ACT or the SAT. They're offered multiple times throughout the spring, summer, and the fall. The College Board has tried to even create more testing dates to allow for makeup dates for tests that were canceled in the fall. The SAT was redesigned several years ago. This is kind of old news, but it's much more similar to the ACT now. Their curriculum, or the high school curriculum, should help prepare them for the SAT. And again, students should meet with their counselors to create or talk about their individualized testing plan. Another big thing, or another huge kind of change, is that the SAT will no longer offer subject tests. All right, so I've been doing this for a decade now, and before that, the SAT subject tests were a part of, or a requirement from some of the most competitive schools, and no longer are the SATs even offering the subject tests. So schools have not communicated to us what they're going to do in lieu of the SAT subject test. So we're kind of waiting to hear. This just happened this month. So everyone's trying to, all the schools are trying to scramble and figure out what they're going to do now. But if I were to guess, I think they'll probably look for AP scores to be replaced by SAT subject tests in terms of a requirement. So that is standardized testing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Batista. I am the new guidance counselor at Cohasset this year. I'm very excited to be working with all of your students. And I will be taking over for Kevin briefly here. So just to kind of reiterate what we just talked about, testing requirements vary greatly between colleges. Like Kevin said, most schools, if not all, are going to be test optional for next year, but you want to make sure you're checking specific requirements for each school that your student is interested in. Because they are going to have sometimes very different requirements. So we can move on from there. So some of the things that we talked about with your students in the junior workshops last week are some college search resources to get them started on finding colleges or universities that they might be interested in. And one of the biggest ones we recommend is our college search platform, Naviance. It's connected to Cohasset schools, so all of our students' information is in there, and they really have access to so many resources in searching schools. There's different match quizzes that they can take to help them narrow down their lists. And we showed them some of those search options in our workshops last week. So you can log on with them and take a look at that. That's a really great resource to get started. Another great resource are the individual college university websites. This is where you're going to go for that really in-depth specific information about programs, accessing virtual tours, specific statistics regarding admission or programs, etc. So that's going to be a wealth of information and probably where you're going to find the most accurate information. So if you're finding a school on a different website, make sure you go to their official school website to get the most up-to-date information, especially now with all of the changes happening regarding COVID. That's going to be where you're going to find the most accurate information about the application process for them. Another great resource are college visits. This is a really great way if a student finds a school on the internet that they might be interested in applying to. It's a great way to see if that school really is a fit. I know in my personal experience, there was a school I was looking at that I was not really interested in, but as soon as I got on campus, I could really see how it was going to fit for me. So it's a great way, if possible, to get a tour. That's going to be changing, obviously, with COVID too. Schools aren't offering in-person tours as of now, but fingers crossed, looking into the spring, into the summer, that would be a really, great opportunity if those are available. Another thing that kind of came out of this whole COVID crisis, where schools are, sorry for the bell, schools are offering really in-depth virtual tours, which are technologically astounding to me. The way that they can arrange these really cool photos or video tours. And that's a really great way to see a campus, say, if they're not offering in-person tours, or if it's on the other side, if it's on the coast of California and you can't get a flight out there. So highly recommend using college tours and asking lots of questions and meeting with current students if possible. We also set up a Google Classroom for our guidance department, where we're going to be hosting tons of different resources for our students. And you can be added as a parent or guardian on that Google Classroom, and we'll post periodic updates, interesting articles involving the college search and application process, et cetera. So that's a good way to stay involved with our department. And then the College Board and the ACT websites are great places to look at resources for both, college searches, but more so with that standardized testing. So those are some initial resources that we gave to the students to start that college search process. So as they begin to formulate a list of schools that they're interested in based on, whatever preferences they're looking at, whether they want a big school, small school, there's a variety of different, criteria that they might come up with. We encourage them to develop a balanced list. And when we say balanced, we mean that the student should have approximately equal numbers of safety or likely schools, target realistic schools, and reach schools. And so when I say a safety or a likely school, that's going to be a school that statistically, based on their GPA and their standardized test scores, they are well above the average admission to that school. And then that target realistic school, they're at that kind of 50th percentile. They are that average admitted student. And then for the reach schools, they're going to be on that lower half, below that 50th percentile of admitted students. The chances of admission are still possible, but might be unlikely. And we say we want this balanced list because ultimately at the end, when they're making a decision, this kind of method of applying to schools is going to give them the most opportunity to pick a school that works best for them. If you apply to all these reach schools, there's that possibility that you might not get into any of them for whatever reason it might be. And then you have no options to choose from when it comes to making your decision. So that's kind of how we instruct students to strategize their application process. And you might be asking, well, how would you know necessarily where that school falls for your student? On Naviance, that college application and search platform I was just telling you about, there's this really cool feature called scattergrams. And this plots your student based on their GPA and their SAT score, surrounded by other Cohasset students that have applied to that school in the past. There's no identifying information on here. It's just to give you a visual of where students are. So the green check marks are acceptances to that school, the red X's are denials, and the purple dots are wait lists. So if you're surrounded by several green check marks, that might be a likely school for that student, versus if you are surrounded by more red X's, that might be more of a reach. If you're kind of right in the middle, that's probably a good target school. This is not an admissions decision. The scattergrams just give you an idea of where you might fall to help you kind of balance your list in that way. Okay. All right, and I am going to hand it over to Laura, and she's going to finish up the presentation for you.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go through a few more quick slides, and then if people do have questions, they're welcome to put questions in the Q&A section, and we're happy to work through as many of them as we can for those of you that want to stay and ask a few questions. So this particular slide reviews application plans. And it's probably, I said to the kids, it's a little bit early to really start thinking about how they want to apply to schools. I recommend that they just find schools that they love, and then we can kind of strategize and make those decisions later. But just so that you have awareness as you move through your research process with your student, there's often some confusion between early decision and early action, since they sound similar. In early decision, the way that I sort of say it is essentially you're making a decision already. So if a student applies early decision, it's typically a November deadline and it's binding. So the student applies, for example, November 1st. They oftentimes will hear like around the holidays, and then they'll have a short period of time in which they can respond. The only way to remove yourself from an early decision commitment is if the school has been unable to meet your financial need. So if a student's concerned that they're not going to get enough financial aid from a school, they can still apply early decision. And if that's not the case and the school won't give them any more, in that situation, they can go ahead and back out of the commitment. I do want to note too, now a number of schools, I've seen an increasing amount of schools institute an early decision 2 plan. So oftentimes that might be in January. So for example, if a student's early process didn't go as they anticipated, or if they just changed their mind and said, you know what, I really love the school, I'm ready to commit, then they might be able to go ahead and apply early decision 2. They can't have more than one early decision school out there, so they would have had to hear back from their early decision 1 school. But early decision 2 has been sort of an increasing option lately, I've noticed, which is great. Early action is a similar timeline, so apply early November. You'll receive a decision typically around the holidays, maybe a little bit later, sometimes into January. And then you know whether or not you got in, but there's no commitment. So early action is a wonderful way to apply to safety schools. The kids apply early, they get a few yeses in their back pocket around the holidays, and they're feeling good about the process overall. The one thing that we don't want students to do is apply to a number of schools that are going to be more difficult for them to get into early action, because the reality is early action is the most competitive way to apply, for the reason that schools are only taking students through early action that they know for sure that they would take at any point in time. They don't need to look at the regular decision pool to say, we're certain that we want to accept this student. So if a student, for example, just applies early action to their reach or their difficult target schools, or even regular target schools, and they get a bunch of no's or deferrals, which is very common. A deferral is when they get put into the regular pool. Sometimes they might feel a little bit defeated. So we just want to keep that in mind in terms of, I say, put your eggs in the basket that you know where it's going to kind of pan out. Use that early action, the time and resources that you have to apply to the schools that you have a good shot of getting into in that early process. Rolling admission is when you apply. We recommend you apply on the earlier side because they fill spots as they receive applications. So oftentimes the student might apply, and then maybe in about 6 weeks or so, 4 to 6 weeks, they'll get an answer from that school. And then regular decision is just the standard application timeline. Oftentimes it's apply around January 1st or sometimes up to February. They'll get an answer around March, April. And then everybody has to have made a decision by May 1st. They will have had to make a commitment to a school and put down a deposit to attend. And if kids aren't ready for early, it's perfectly acceptable to do regular. I have a number of students who just weren't ready and they're working through the regular. We don't want them to rush it. And I think sometimes students feel a bit of pressure to apply on the early side. The one thing that I didn't mention about early decision, which is a pretty important part about it, is that early decision will often give students a leg up in terms of an acceptance there. So for example, a student who's on the cusp of being admitted to a certain school, they apply early decision, and that's what kind of tips the scale in their favor. So that is oftentimes what might prompt a student to go ahead and apply early decision. And if you have, your student has certain schools that offer early decision, you can look up the stats and you'll see stats, for example, we accepted 30% or 40% of our freshman class through the early decision plan. It's very common for students. Let's say I have a student with a 3.8 GPA and they apply regular, and I have a student with a 3.5 GPA and they apply ED. Maybe that 3.5 student's going to get in and the 3.8 isn't. I mean, there's more context to it, but it certainly can give students an advantage. Do I just press this arrow? Yeah, okay. So I know they talked about a little bit about the Naviance program already, but just to give a full overview, and I think this is pretty much the exact slide that we showed your students. We as counselors use Naviance to track college admissions data. We use it to communicate with students. We use it to schedule college representative visits. This is when we have college admissions officers come into the school in the fall. Certainly we hope that that's going to be an option next fall. We hope we'll be able to welcome them back. And we also use Naviance to transmit documentation to colleges. So it's good for students to become comfortable with the program, because this is how they're going to manage their process from an organizational perspective, requesting transcripts, letting us know where they're applying. This is what we use this system for. But the students can also use it now researching colleges. There's some interest inventories. They can complete a resume. They don't have to. They could do that on the side, but there is a feature for that. They can sign up for the college reps directly through Naviance if we are able to have those, and then they'll formally request transcripts and teacher recommendations via the online portal on Naviance. So it's great for them to just become comfortable using the program. I'll briefly touch on financial aid. A few key things to be aware of, particularly if you haven't been through this process before. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. Any student applying for financial aid is going to have to fill out the FAFSA. So for any school, that is the form that gets filled out. It becomes available in October of senior year, and you just want to kind of check and be aware of deadlines for each individual school. They can vary. Another important one to be aware of is the CSS profile. This is never required by public schools, but it is sometimes required by private schools. So for some private schools, for example, maybe like Providence College, you're going to do the FAFSA because you're applying for financial aid, but then they're also going to say, we want you to do the CSS profile as well. So you have to check the individual requirements for each school in terms of which forms they're looking for financial aid and what their school-specific deadlines are. The next piece that people often inquire about is the community scholarships. These are the scholarships that are given out on class night. And the nice thing about these scholarships is that we don't distribute any information about them to the senior class until typically around March. So at that point, they're pretty much done applying to schools. They don't have to worry about dealing with applying for community scholarships while they're filling out their application. So it's an entirely separate process that happens sort of after the fact. Local and regional scholarships, we go ahead and post these. And now that we utilize Google Classroom, we'll keep a running list for their class when the time comes. These usually start to come out in like November of senior year. These are scholarships that aren't affiliated with the school, but that we think might be of interest to the kids, or they might have a shot at getting them. For example, like a Rockland Trust scholarship, something of that nature. And then MEFA, that's the Massachusetts Educational Financing Authority. They put on seminars, webinars. Their website has a wealth of information. So if you are sort of just starting out or doing this for the first time, and I would say, check out the MEFA website, and you're going to find a lot of good stuff there. The John and Abigail Adams Award. So you'll hear about this, and then there's also the Koplik Award, which we have on the next slide. These are good to be aware of. These are merit-based programs that basically provide a tuition credit towards Massachusetts state schools. Tuition, it makes it sound like a little bit more than it is. It typically runs around maybe like $1,500 a year, but it is for 4 years. So it's not nothing. But typically with state universities, their fees make up most of the cost of the school versus the tuition. But the John and Abigail Adams Scholarship, essentially, if students are in the top 25% of MCAS scores in their school district, and they score in the advanced category on at least one section, then they would qualify for the Adams Award. And this is a list. Basically, we receive information, we get the list from the Department of Ed, and then we go ahead and send letters out. So your student would be notified during senior year if they did get the Adams Award. And then the COPLIC is somewhat similar. You have to have a qualifying MCAS score, but for COPLIC, there's one additional step that they have to take. So if a student is applying to Massachusetts public universities, they qualify for the COPLIC but not the Adams, then they would need to submit two AP exams, and now the subject tests are going to be irrelevant. So that's something that will change there. So I don't know if any of those requirements will be different, but they do have to submit additional information of scores that they've achieved in order to get the COPLIC and use that for a tuition waiver in Massachusetts state schools. The COPLIC letters, I believe, they come out in the spring of junior year. So that would be something that students would be notified about this year versus the Adams, which would be fall of senior year. It is possible for a student to be on the list for COPLIC and then also be on the list for Adams. So to kind of wrap it up, people always want to know sort of what should we be doing now? And, you know, there's a few things that kids should be doing right now. So winter of junior year, kind of where we're at. If they have not paid for their AP exams, they're going to have to go ahead and do that. Think about when they want to test and register, and meet with us when they feel they're ready. And then they're going to want to research schools. And I always say this is kind of the hardest part of the process, in my opinion. Taking the schools, there's so many schools out there, and sort of whittling it down to a manageable list, I think can be a real overwhelming challenge for some of the kids. And I find it to be much more work sometimes than even the application process itself. So investing the time in researching schools now is going to help them a great deal later. And then moving in towards the end of junior year, we're going to want to see them starting to develop a preliminary list of schools. Maybe there's, 20 or 30 schools on that list. That's fine. We just want them to have something kind of concrete to work with over the summer. Schedule tours. I mean, this year, hopefully virtual tours will turn into in-person tours at some point, but there are a number of virtual events that schools have been hosting and will continue to host for the time being. So we would definitely recommend that students engage in those at any point in time that they're ready. As mentioned, plan for a challenging senior year course load. And then during the summer, again, just continuing the research. They're going to draft their college essay. That will be a summer assignment for the English class. So it'll sort of automatically be something that they have to work on. Start to think about different application plans, how they want to apply, when they want to apply. Request teacher letters of recommendation. Oftentimes students may ask a teacher before the end of junior year. And if they're ready to do that, we would definitely recommend it. It's kind of nice to sort of check that box. And I think the kids feel relieved once they know they have a teacher that's ready and willing to write for them. And then complete the self-evaluation, which is something that we use to write their counselor recommendation. It's basically their ability to give input into their counselor recommendation for college. We're in the process of redoing it, so it's not available yet, but we'll be putting it into the Google Classroom once we've updated that form. Keys to success. So as mentioned, now is the time for researching and planning so that they have a solid list going into the fall and they don't need to be worrying too much about doing that at that point. Visit and attend as many sessions as they can to learn about schools, whether it's virtual or in person. Stay organized and apply well before the deadlines just to sort of reduce the stress level whenever possible. If any questions come up at all about the process, we see the students here, but you're also welcome to meet with us, to call us, shoot us an email if you have a question, and we're always kind of happy to help and support you however you need. Here's our contact information, some links that you guys can use that will hopefully be helpful. And now if anybody has any questions, we can go ahead and address those now. Does anybody have any questions? If you want to, you can go ahead and put into Okay, so will this class take the final MCAS that is needed for graduation, or is that going to be waived due to COVID? We don't have the information for that yet. That information comes from the Department of Ed, and unfortunately, there's been no final decision on what's going to happen with that. I imagine that Mr. Scott will send out information via his newsletter once he is aware.
And so for parents to get access to the Google Classroom, if you just email one of your whoever counselor works with your student, we'll be able to add your email directly to the Google Classroom so that you can have access to it. Your student can also invite you as a parent guardian, so they could just copy and paste your email and invite you that way too. So there's kind of two ways to do that.
Is ED only to one school? You can only apply ED to one. Yes. So you can only have one early decision application out at a time. So there could be a case where you do ED1, the student hears back and they get deferred or they don't get in, and then they could go ahead and put out an ED2 application. But an early decision is binding. So, you can't commit to 2 universities at once. So you can only have one early decision application active at a time. And this is something that an early decision application requires a parent sign off and a counselor sign off, so that the colleges can kind of regulate and make sure that students are only applying to one ED school at a time. All right, so here's a question. Most schools are test optional for next year. Any sense for 2022 grads and whether the SAT will be required? I don't think we have any sense of that yet. We actually, in Brian's newsletter this week, we are going to be sending out an article and some sort of additional information just about sort of the feelings and the general changes to the evolving college application process, some that have happened fairly quickly because of COVID. But I think at this point, we're sort of year by year in terms of what's happening. And I think the pandemic has presented an opportunity for colleges to reevaluate their process. So I think that colleges will be making individual changes, but I think that remains to be seen, and we just kind of adjust along the way. For the Adams Scholarship, is it automatic or is there an application process? There's paperwork that you need to fill out and submit to the school. And then essentially, or no, actually you just bring the letter. Sorry, that's for the COPLIC. You just bring the letter to the admissions office. There's no application. It's an automatic award. I'm just reading the next question. Okay, so a question is about testing. Kids were not able to take the test this year. Scheduled test dates have been repeatedly canceled. Would Cohasset consider hosting the test in school for our students? So I know we are hosting tests or planning to host tests. There's no plan to cancel the general test that we have. In terms of an SAT school day, there is no plan for that now. I think it has been discussed. I think some of the logistical considerations about the potential for MCAS, having to keep other kids home from school potentially if we're proctoring an SAT for the junior class. I think it presents some logistical challenges. So to my knowledge, there is not an SAT school day being planned at this point. Okay, since last spring grades were pass-fail, how is that being computed in the GPA? So those grades are not computed in the GPA. So anything that was a credit, no credit is what we did. Those were not computed in the GPA for any student that's here. One thing that I want to add, just as a caveat, even though we're still in the middle of the college application process with the seniors, is that what I have seen overall, because I know there's a lot of kind of maybe more anxiety than usual or more nervousness than usual around the college application process, given everything that's going on and all these changes. I have seen, I mean, to be honest, I think this has been one of the most successful sort of college application processes I've seen so far with a senior class. we still have to get the regular decisions in, but from an early perspective, despite most kids not having test scores, despite grades not being included in the GPA, which is pretty consistent across schools in the country, I have seen probably net benefit to our kids. So I think this trend towards a more holistic process of college applications, to be honest, seems like it's a good thing for our kids. And I share that information to hopefully help put people's minds at ease in terms of approaching this during such a tricky time. Do you think it's a good idea to drive around campuses or walk around? Absolutely. I think even though you might not be able to access a formal tour, I think, we live in an area where we have tons of great colleges and universities around. And if you're able to hop in the car and take a drive, I think that's a great way to start seeing things. I think anything is better than nothing. You might not get the same flair as if it was a tour, but I think it's a great place to start. The presentation will be available. We'll post it online. And there's a recording as well that will go out at some point. And it's in the Google Classroom as well. Can you ED and can you EA at the same time? This is a great question. So it depends on the school. The most likely answer is yes. Most schools that offer an early decision plan will allow students to apply early action to other schools. There is a small handful of schools that may restrict that. So again, students need to read the fine print for each particular school's application plan. Most schools will allow for it, but some of the most competitive schools do place restrictions on it. Or they may allow a student, for example, to apply ED to their university, but only apply to public universities early action at the same time. So generally, yes, but for some schools, there is some fine print. Okay. I know you've mentioned colleges being test optional. However, is it more of an advantage if a student is able to submit test results? So this year, I would say no. Most of our students did not submit test results and so far have fared quite well. Moving forward, I think, we're going to kind of have to see what happens. Generally with test optional, if a school is test optional, truly test optional, then we find that if students don't have scores, then the process still works out just fine. The reality is if a student has scores that fall into the range that the school looks for, then you're going to want to send them. If those scores are not in the range or even on the cusp, it can put students at a disadvantage to send those scores. So I have kids that send scores to some schools and not send scores to others. It really kind of boils down to where the scores fall for each particular school and whether or not it's actually going to benefit them. How will Navient stay current with the test optional policy? So to be honest, there's scores in there, but I would say at this point in time, your best bet is to focus more on GPA when it comes to, there'll still be information about average scores, but the reality is this year, most decisions are being made without those scores. And knowing that many schools are going to continue to be test optional, I think that your best bet is just you can look at the information, you have it, but the GPA is, currently a bigger factor as we move through the process. Do counselors go through the details of PSAT results with each student during their counselor sessions and help with specific tailored strategy? So we're happy to meet with students. We don't meet individually with each student and review results, but if that's something they want to talk about when we meet with them, we are certainly happy to do that. I think what you'll find when you go through the report is, fortunately, when they take it, it's pretty clear cut in terms of what they need to work on and where their strengths were. So a lot of that information can just be pulled from the results. But of course, it's not something we specifically do. We tend to focus our meetings more on research of colleges and a plan for testing. But if the kids have specific questions, of course, and need some guidance in that direction, we're happy to help them. Prep resources for SAT, ACT. Do we have these in the Google Classroom? Maybe not yet. Yeah. We can upload, we don't recommend one particular program. Most programs sort of have the same knowledge base, so it's kind of what works for you. I always say maybe contact 3 different programs and then decide based on like timing, class size, or is it tutoring, cost, what the best match is for your student. We can go ahead, we have a list of some of the programs, and we can go ahead and upload that into the Google Classroom over the course of the next few days. There's some teachers here that do run programs. They're not affiliated with the school, but we can add those as well so that people are aware. Does ED necessarily preclude receiving aid and scholarships? This is a really good question. I think, well, oh, sorry, there's a bell, so I'm gonna wait a minute. Okay. We can't, as a school and as guidance counselors, we can't ask for information from students about what they've received. So it's hard for us to do sort of our own analysis on this. But as you may have heard, and maybe this is why you're asking the question, some people do have a concern that if the student applies ED that they wouldn't get quite as much financially. I don't know how truly that plays out. In my experience, with kids and what's been shared, it doesn't seem to be a huge issue. But it's something to consider sort of in the whole picture when students are deciding what they need and where to apply. But the expectation would be that you could get, decent financial aid if you were eligible for it. And also I have kids that get into schools ED, they don't get enough financial aid. And so they call the financial aid office and potentially lay out a case for why they might need more. Sometimes they might get a little bit more. Sometimes the answer might be no, but it never hurts to ask. I gather the SAT essay is going to be dropped next year. Yep, it is. That's right. That was another announcement that they made with the subject tests. In light of that, does it make any sense at all to do the essay if taking this March? If you look at the number of schools that actually care to look at the SAT essay, it's very, very few. So most of our students, even before SAT announced that they were going to be getting rid of the essay, really never needed to take it in the first place. So we don't feel we're in a position at all that we need to tell kids that they should be taking the essay. I think it's obviously something that's sort of dying and no longer going to be a part of the process. So I would say, unless a school is saying that they require it, which this year I would be shocked, since it's such a limited number to begin with anyway, and with schools going test optional, I would say it's absolutely fine for kids to skip it, and that should not affect their application. The letter for the Adams Scholarship, that's a letter that will go out before the end of this year to students that are eligible for the Adams Scholarship. So that would be received, it's a letter from the Department of Ed, and that would be received in the mail towards the end of June, or sorry, the fall of senior year. The COPLIC will go out in the spring of junior year. Another question about the SAT, concern about getting into SAT test dates. I think I feel encouraged that the students this year are not going to have the same situation as the senior class this year. I think the last go around, I know most schools, were forced to cancel it and there wasn't really much they can do. I think, as things hopefully continue to improve, then schools can go ahead and potentially open up more dates. I don't know if we have a plan to do more than the date that we already, as of now, we don't, have a plan to do more than the one date that we typically do, but we would anticipate that other schools will open up. And I think it's also an ongoing conversation with the administration in terms of weighing what we think, may happen and how many test centers will be available and will our kids be able to get in. I think it's a conversation that will continue as we see how things evolve. Registering for AP exams is just bringing a check to the guidance office. The PSAT grade is listed on Naviance. Are PSAT scores provided to colleges? No, they are not. It's truly just a practice test. PSAT scores go into Naviance so that kids can see where their scores fall for particular schools. Colleges can't access any of the data in Naviance, any of that admissions data, and we don't send them along. They're not really interested in PSAT scores. They only want official SAT scores or ACT, if anything. I'm gonna, since you're probably sick of hearing my voice, so I'm gonna pass over to Mr. McGowan, and he'll continue to answer a few of the questions. Letters of recommendation.
Any suggestions on how students should approach letters of recommendation from teachers, considerations for determining who to select? So it's going to vary for each situation. What I typically tell students, well, it should be one, a junior year teacher, and who it should be you can look at a couple different factors. So if you're going into a specific area of study, you might want, like engineering, for example, you might want a math teacher. But one thing, we've looked at a couple surveys or recommendations from schools, but what they're looking for in a teacher letter of recommendation. And one thing that I've consistently seen is they want to see examples of when students have hit adversity or seen adversity and how they've overcome it. So if it's a teacher, so a lot of times people think about it as a teacher who teaches a class where they've performed well, but it might be good to have a teacher who maybe you struggled initially and you met with that teacher after hours or, in utility, and you figure out how to work through the adversity. So that's a different way to look at it too. It should only be, again, one teacher. The overwhelming majority of schools only require one teacher letter of recommendation, and many don't read past the required amount. If you do find some schools that require more than one, then obviously you can ask a different one. But in the interest of not wasting teachers' time, we try to encourage students to only ask one teacher letter of recommendation. So what is being communicated to colleges about classes our students took no credit last year? The student received graduation credit for so if you want to take additional biology. So what we so on the school profile this year, we are specific, and we'll put the same thing next year on the school profile. And we go into the specifics of the situation last year regarding credit and non-credit and how that's factored into the GPA. If there are really specific examples or specific situations that are more nuanced and need explanation, in addition to the school profile, we're happy to write a narrative about that situation. That could be included in our letter of recommendation, or we can even do a supplemental letter on official letterhead to explain that situation. Are you seeing a lot of student deferrals for 2021 graduating year? No, I mean, for the 2021 graduating year, I don't have anyone who has mentioned to me if they are deferring. I think last year's class had at least a few that I'm aware of, but for 2021, that so far is not the case. Overall this year, since it was test optional, did you see more essays? I did not. So I did not see more essays or more supplemental essays on the application, but going along with the test optional theme, what I would stress is you're right. Like a school like UMass Amherst is a great example of this. Like their whole approach to admissions it's very numbers based. Like we could draw a line from down where exactly the cutoff is for the GPA and standardized test scores in the past. Well, that's out the window now because they're test optional. So so that puts more emphasis on the GPA. And then what's left. So I do think variables like extracurricular, but the essay, really the college essay are in the recommendations, like those are much more important and heightened than they might have been in years past, especially with a school like UMass Amherst, or compared to a place like Connecticut College. That's not the case. This is kind of old hat for them. So it's no big deal. So it's going to vary from school to school what changes, but I do think it does emphasize the other variables in this process for sure. now that schools like UMass Amherst or, URI, New Hampshire, all these schools that are, especially large state schools, are test optional. How are spots available in schools being influenced by this? That's going to vary from school to school. And that's something as students, and to be honest, I haven't had any messages from schools that have said that's having a big impact on their process at all. But that's going to vary school. Oops, hold on one second. All right, that's going to vary. That's going to vary school to school, and that's something that as you're doing webinars or workshops or meetings with admission reps, you can ask them specifically, and you can talk to them. Can you talk about super scoring the ACT? So super scoring, similar to the SAT, the ACT, you can have it super scored, and it will show the different, it will take the strongest scores from the different areas, and it'll change the composite score a little bit, or it'll change the composite score based on the improvement in those various areas. Please read the questions out loud. Okay, sorry. Can we email you for a list of local and regional scholarships available in the fall of senior year? Yes, you can. So for the local scholarship specifically, we have a workshop, or not a workshop. We have in March every year, we will have a senior meeting where we distribute all of the local scholarships in one single packet. So that way all the students get the local scholarships, and they can apply to the ones that are appropriate for them. For the regional and even the national scholarships that are not local, we advertise them as they come, and we'll give we'll hand those out and have a comprehensive list in Google Classroom. All right, I think that is the last one, unless anyone types. This was fun. This is different, but I miss doing it in person. I miss actually seeing the faces. So hopefully we can do that next year when we have the next parent coffee. But email us if you want to set up, if you have any questions, email us and set up a time you want to talk. And as questions come, I always say with this process, right? Like, I think it's nice we set up these like family meetings and student meetings, and like there's a couple lengthier ones, but really it's an ongoing dialogue. So like as questions come up throughout the process, don't feel like anything's too small to ask, because obviously there's a lot that goes into this, and it's really an ongoing thing. So it's a lot of times it's short check-ins or questions that we can help with, and we're happy to do so. So I'm glad I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you guys or talk to you soon. All right, bye-bye.